As Kelly said, my name is Terry Sunderland. I am a professor of tropical forestry at the University of British Columbia. I'm also a research associate with the Center for International Forestry Research. And this session, we're focusing on commitment to action, basically looking at developing effective strategies to operationalize integrated landscape approaches. I've been privileged over the years to work at the interface between practice and the science of landscape approaches in many different parts of the world. And I've also been involved in the GLF since its inception in 2013. The first meeting was in Warsaw in 2013. Anybody else in Warsaw from this meeting? No, okay, just me. I'm older than you think. So anyway, the session is essentially to showcase the work of people actually doing landscape approaches. And we have a fantastic panel here representing institutions that are working on the ground. IUCN, RECOF TC, Eco Agriculture Partners, and obviously the International Model Forest Network. And over the last 12, 13 years of the GLF and promoting landscape approaches, the tagline has been #ThinkLandscape. This session is about #doinglandscape. We're going to hear from people who are actually doing landscape approaches on the ground and hear from their experience. So without further ado, I'm going to actually ask the panel to quickly introduce themselves, and then we're going to go through 3 rounds of discussion, posing questions to the panelists based on their respective experiences, and then I'm going to do a summation at the end. So, Richard, please.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Rich Verbisky, the head of the International Model Forest Network Secretariat here in Ottawa.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Patricia Bon. I'm at Eco Agriculture Partners. I'm Brazilian. I'm based in the Dominican Republic. Most of my background is with participatory planning and landscape management. So.
Well, this is Ron McCollum, Ron. Can you hear me? Should I switch it on? Switch on the mic.
Switch on the mic.
Hi, this is Ron Tiracanon Oron, Strategic Senior Advisors of RECOF, the Regional Community Forestry Training Center for Asia and the Pacific.
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Malaika Yanu. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Chalmers University of Technology in Sweden, Gothenburg. My background is landscape approaches, and I also work with local knowledge and knowledge integration and knowledge co-production. Thanks.
Hi everyone, my name is Pragyan Pokhrel. I'm with the International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN, Senior Program Officer for Forest and Grasslands.
Thank you, all of you, and it's a pleasure to have you all here on stage with us. So the first round of questions is essentially clearing the terrain. You know, how do we remove the barriers to landscape approaches? And as someone who's practiced many of these approaches on the ground, there are many, many barriers, institutional, contextual, policy, etc. But we're going to ask each of the panelists to provide 3-minute interventions on what are the key operational challenges in implementing landscape approaches, and how does incentivizing multi-sector integration address climate and development objectives. And these are guiding questions, as we talked about in the brief earlier, but please come from your own institutional perspectives and just give us a 3-minute overview of where you are institutionally on these issues. Richard, please start.
Thanks. So I would say, I guess I've got a couple of notes here, and I would start off by saying implementing landscape approaches, implementing means action, action beyond words, and it's one of the taglines that we have with our model forests. That's part of what we do. You mentioned, Terry, do landscapes, and maybe that's something we need to consider, is about maybe changing our tagline, but landscapes and partnerships in action. You need partnerships to do things together, to speed up, to be more efficient, to take and seize challenges, to be nimble. It takes partners. You can't address things on a landscape alone. So to me, those are key things to doing. And you need to have a common goal, a common understanding, so that everyone is rowing essentially in unison or the same way together. The challenge on a landscape could also be in implementing. Things are big. Big challenges arise. So you think about, okay, how am I going to address climate change? That's a big one. how am I going to address, we were talking in the session with the Latin Americans, peace. You know, like this is big stuff. So my suggestion would be on implementing landscape approaches that we don't get overwhelmed with the big things and we think about what are the things that we can do. Is there a small thing that we can do? Gain momentum, learn, share that experience and move forward. So I think those are a couple of things, I think, from the implementation side. And just briefly then on the multi-sectoral side, all I would say is that I think any investments that are made in multi-stakeholder partnerships, those are very important. They show dividends beyond the returns of initial investments without any issue. So I'll pass it on now to Patricia.
It is very appropriate that you mention partnerships because eco-agriculture partners are now going to...
The name can't say it more.
Exactly. Thank you. Patricia.
Exactly. Thank you so much. So Eco-Agriculture Partners has been working with the landscape approach for about 20 years now. And over this time, we've learned that there are 3 key things that are really helpful for landscape to thrive. And the first one is to have a network of people, much like the national regional networks nurtured by the International Model Forest Network. That's really important. The second is capacity strengthening, not only to support landscape partners with technical skills for reforestation, conservation, and the work that they're doing on the ground, but also for governance. They really need to learn how to manage their landscapes more effectively. And the third one is funding. And the funding piece is really interesting because we know that model forests, we know that landscape, they receive funding. They have multiple different activities and projects happening on the ground. So we know that the funding is coming in, but there's a big but here. Very often the donors are not providing funding for governance. They're not providing funding for management, for coordination, convening, facilitation, bringing partners together to develop a shared vision, to map out landscape partners, to develop a collaborative landscape action plan. And the reality is that donors infrequently want to fund that because they want to provide money and funding to things that they can measure, that are very specific, that have clear indicators. They want to provide funding for tree planting, for a number of hectares of reforested, oh my goodness, I got lost on the word there, land. So I think, to me, that's one of the biggest operational challenges. We really need to, donors to understand that funding needs to go to management, to convening, to coordination, to support the governance piece of the landscape work.
That's a fantastic point. I mean, the issue of funding the tangibles is the norm. Funding the intangibles are essential. Rekoff TC, Ron, please.
Right. Okay. Well, I have to say that my talk is not representing an expert on the landscape approach, yeah? So I don't want to call myself as an expert, but probably more experienced than number of people here over the last 4 decades that I worked on the participatory natural resource management, community forestry in Asia and Pacific, in Eastern Africa. Yeah, we observed that in the landscape, you talk about different type of land use. You talk about different type of stakeholders who have different interests within the landscape. And then you talk about the tenure and rights of those stakeholders who want to exercise their rights to obtain their benefits. So how can we keep the balance and ensuring that we understand their perspective and interests and help them to exercise optimized use of their tenure and rights in terms of getting, managing their resources? Well, when you talk about barriers, I would like to flip the coin talking about opportunities. There are many policies, law exists in the landscape. It's just a matter how we harmonize all these policies and law and then make use of these policies and law and put that in practice. There are many agency sector working towards sustainable goals. We just need to realize those and then make use of those.
Thank you. Malaika, you come from a slightly different perspective, not an institutional one as such, but you've just completed your PhD on a fantastic study of looking at the comparison between knowledge systems, traditional knowledge systems and Western systems, and how they sometimes align and sometimes how they conflict. But you worked in a landscape in southern Zambia, in Kalomo, which is what are these complex landscapes? So please share your experiences.
Yeah, thank you, Terry. Yes, from my experience as an early career researcher, I realized that, yeah, implementing landscape approach has a lot of challenges. First of all, I think power relations are one of the challenges that I have experienced when I was in Zambia. And in terms of knowledge system and knowledge order, there are sometimes moment where the most marginalized group are left behind, and basically their knowledge, their local knowledge is not considered. But I think even sometimes when they are at the table of conversation, this kind of engagement is not active at all, but is kind of passive and rhetoric. And I found that's very interesting. So I think one potential solution can be having like a shared kind of stewardship of local actors. And then another point is political winds. I think this kind of challenge can really influence how landscape context can be changed. And actually, based on what Patricia was saying, I think also like develop this kind of donor landscape is also very complicated, because to me at least is always more a kind of development kind of aid, when in some cases should be already integrated in certain kind of policy landscape. And then as I have been working on knowledge integration, I found very interesting how this kind of integration actually sometimes can not be converted into knowledge co-production, but actually kind of assimilate and can make the most marginalized one more invisible. And then I think a last point would be the private sector. In Calomo, we also try to engage private sector. And when I say private sector, I'm not referring to small-scale farmers, of course, but more a kind of company sector that kind to make themselves invisible in the landscape. And even as a researcher, as a research team, we try to make them more visible and engage them more. I think at the same time we have to be very careful, because engaging this kind of actor can also skew further unbalanced kind of power relation. And then I think another big challenge probably for integrated landscape approach is try to move from a project-based kind of process to a real kind of process that is really already integrated in the landscape context. And then the second question was a kind of about integration. I think, integration can also be a kind of double-edged sword, so to speak, can bring together different kind of actors and also the different kind of perspective and different kind of challenges for each of them. And indeed, when I was in Zambia and we worked with a couple of multi-stakeholder platform, one government-led and the other one was NGO-based, NGO-led, and there was this effort to put like everybody, all the different actors together, but then problem of resources means problem of miscommunication sometimes, problem of misrepresentation, and unclear kind of rights were very, very present. So integration has a good potential, but also has to be treated very carefully.
Thank you. I really like that point about the private sector trying to remain invisible, despite the fact they are probably the main actor in many of the landscapes that we're all concerned with. Let's hear from IUCN.
Yes, thank you. Tough to follow all of that, because I feel like most of you said what I wanted to say. No, as Terry said, his first GLF was in Warsaw. Mine was in GLF Africa. I think it was the first one in 2018. And whilst I was scribbling some of the notes on my flight to Ottawa, I was thinking, I'm not an expert either, but I am a practitioner. And one thing I do like doing is observing. So I'll borrow some of the anecdotes from people I've encountered, and I'll start with my grandmother. Growing up in Nepal, a family of long lines of farming background, agriculture is always looked at as something that is destroying environment. And my grandmother always used to say, when we used to have all of experts coming into our village, that it's easy to talk about forest conservation when you're not living next to one. Mm-hmm. And I think that is something that we should all recognize. There are a lot of practitioners here around in the room, which I'm really delighted to see and also engage. Our work at IUCN revolves a lot on restoration, forest landscape restoration. We're very proud of that, from Bond Challenge, supporting the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. And there are a couple of things I always say is that, we talk about planting trees, but we're not planting trees, we're planting seedlings, saplings, and then trees, planting trees and maturing trees are a commitment, so it's a long-term vision. But then when you go into a community and you want to plant trees, you first need to start planting trust. Trust between communities, trust between governments, trust between communities and governments as well. You can't just go in and find, this barren land and just start planting. So one of, I think, the urgency we have sometimes maybe blinds us to this long-term process. So I feel like that is one barrier. How do we balance the long-term vision and the short-term pressures? We are all project-bound, time-bound. We have 2030 targets like hovering around. We had Aichi targets before. The Millennium Development Goals. Are we moving to 2050? Like how long are we, kicking the can down the road? Like as a young professional, sometimes it's frustrating to see that, the way we, sometimes articulate our success is by kicking the can down the road and saying we'll do our job better, but are we, and then flipping it aside on the integration, I feel like, one of the things we're working hard with some of the model forests that we're working with is linking them with some of the vertical climate funds that are available. We're using model forest and the resources and the expertise and the governance structure that are already existing to make them the prime ground for giving additional funding so that we do not only scale up, but also scale deep. Thank you.
No, that latter point, particularly using existing governance platforms, I think, like you'll probably touch on in the second round, but that's actually critical in many of the landscapes that we've had experience of working in. So the second round of interventions is basically showcasing successes. So all of you institutionally have been working in the field, and there are many lessons to be learned, both good and bad, and for better or for ill, as we say. So Richard, would you like to share, again, from the International Model Forest Network, some of your successes? What's worked and what maybe hasn't worked quite so well in the operationalization of your landscape approaches?
Thanks, Terry. Just a sec there we warm up. Thanks, Terry. Yeah, I guess I would start off by saying that, success stories, we have, and we're proud of a network of 60 model forests in over 30 countries. Each one of those model forests has many, many exemplary cases of success on their landscape. So, there's a huge multiplier there. It's tough for me to probably signal at one thing, but I would also say that, and maybe I failed to stress it in the first round of questions, but we're talking about processes. Model forests are about processes. They are long enduring things, much like the challenges on the landscape. So these are 60 governance platforms around the world that in some cases have long legs or a long tail. We're in the Eastern Ontario Model Forest. I was just speaking before with Brian Barclay, who is the original general manager of this model forest, and the kind of the mandate statements of the model forest 34 years ago happened on this stage with 180 people represented from the landscape around. So we are in the heart of this model forest. Success stories, as I mentioned, there were many. Yesterday we heard from regional updates, and there were a lot of inspiring stories. I'm going to just touch on two, and one is the Eastern Ontario Model Forest. Years ago, one of the challenges on the landscape here was how to get or improve the access of our maple syrup, a non-timber forest product from our landscape here, to markets in a better place, more timely, and diversify those markets to improve livelihoods. Well, they addressed and they challenged certification processes. The very first organic maple syrup that was certified in the world was done a few kilometers from here. So you want to talk about innovation and you want to talk about practical examples. That led to then markets for local communities and local landowners to get their maple syrup to places like Israel that they'd never dreamed of before. So quite interesting there. The other one would be maybe, for example, the Chorotega model forest in Costa Rica. Costa Rica also has challenges with wildland fire, and they simulated a model, a Canadian model, the Fire Weather Index, and they calibrated it at a landscape level first within the Chorotega model forest. And that eventually led to scaling up and a national early warning system for fire. That was the first ever time that was done in that country. So 2 examples, I think, of model forests being practical.
That's great, thank you.
Thanks so much, Richard. So Eco-Agriculture Partners has been working for many years on, well, one of the big things that we do is capacity strengthening. And I'm here with Max, who works with me in our capacity strengthening team. And a lot of that work is helping landscape partners think about how they can better practice management, how they can better manage their land and practice integrated landscape management and govern their land better. And one project that I'm really proud of that we started last year with funding from the International Model Forest Network, with funding from Natural Resources Canada, is a different spin on what we've been doing for a very long time. We traditionally do training, so online training, in-person training, workshops, and we sometimes stop at that. And this time we took it further than that, and we created a very comprehensive capacity strengthening program that includes a few different elements. And one of those elements is the training that we always do, in person and online. The other element is that we created the space for sharing and learning, a community of practice. But the third really important piece of this project is we implemented what we're calling seed projects. So we're currently working with 15 model forests in Latin America. And all of the model forests that are participating, they could prepare a proposal and apply for one of these seed project funding opportunities. And we were very happy that last year all 15 model forests from Latin America applied and received the funding. And because of that, all of them had an opportunity to apply something that they were learning in the training that Max leads. So all of them picked something that they saw was a weakness in their governance structure to focus on. So I'm going to give just a couple of examples. One of them was, is Viviane from Ilha Baiana here? So Ilha Baiana is an amazing example. They created this really creative stakeholder mapping activity that they then carried out in their landscape. I think is Augusto from Abancay is also here. Another great example. They already had a loosely formed landscape partnership. They took it a step further with the seed grant and formalized that structure, created a landscape agreement that then really mapped out who each of the partners were in their governance structure, what they were each responsible for. So for all of the funding was small, but we felt that it was really catalyzing. We saw that these model forests were really taking their governance to a whole different level. So it was a very special example for Eco-Agriculture Partners, but the success stories are actually these 15 model forests. So I actually wanted to ask, could the 15 model forests that received the funding, ustedes pueden quedarse de pie? Vamos a ver quién son esos casos de suceso. Las 15 paisajes que recibieron los fondos semilla. ¿Pueden levantarse? I think some of them are here with us today. So I think they deserve a big round of applause. So thank you very much. I think I'm running out of time, but I will say that Claudia Rojas, who's here, she has been mapping out all of this experience, and she can tell you a lot more about all of the amazing success stories that they've done, and also please speak to the model forests themselves. So thank you.
Thank you. Ron,
All right,
please.
thanks a lot, Terry. Well, I think it's not easy to identify the successful case studies because no one site fit all. And also the case study keep changing the context, the trends, and there are so many things around, and even when you talk about the climate change dialogue and things like that. So I would not like to name any specific case studies, but I would say that there are many lessons that we can learn from the Asia model forest. So, well, for instance, like in Karut, we can learn from Karut watershed management, talking about the governance structure, how can we engage with the government agencies, getting their support in terms of running the forest ecosystem restoration or something like that. Or even in Ngao model forest, how to work with ethnic minorities or local people groups, to protect the fire by using the specific species crop and things like that. So I would say that in many model forests offer a lot of lessons. It's just a matter how we can promote the lessons of the model forest to outside of these communities. So Rickhoff applied the approach we call participatory action research in terms of allowing stakeholders to work together in many forms. Even probably you might have heard the concept of farmer field school, joint learning together, multi-stakeholder processes. So we bring government agencies, development agencies, local people to work toward the common visions. So many of these landscapes, if they have their own common visions, then they have to craft their ways to meet their vision within a certain period of time by mobilizing their resources. As I mentioned earlier, in the landscape, there are many stakeholders who have resources, agenda, program, project, initiatives. So the participatory action research help in terms of pooling, and also when our speaker talking about the power dynamic. Also, participatory action research help addressing the power dynamic, the inequitabilities, status, bring gender, social inclusion into the governance processes. Well, one thing that probably we need to be aware, we have to keep adapting all the time, because the donor communities, sometimes as Patricia mentions, they have their own agenda and shifting around in different geographic space. So we need to adapt onto those. And then, well, the good thing is that we have to let the landscape stakeholder stand on their own feet. Yeah, so as I said, no one size fits all, but we are promoting the participatory approach to allow stakeholders to talk to each other.
That's a great point. No one size fits all. There's no one landscape approach. There are many landscape approaches. No silver bullet. Malika, please.
Yeah, thank you. When it comes to successful stories, I'm not sure I'm part of one, but I would say that from my experience and also with our project group, we always try not to get trapped into a false kind of dichotomy of successful and failure as well, because for who is a successful, for who is a failure, so there are always different perspectives also in this sense, but I also think that they can be like example of the same times of successful segment during the process and failure kind of segment during the process. And probably one thing that can help is to try to, in terms of research, of course, try to develop a kind of indicators during the process that try to help and advise where to move forward. And also I think one thing that I forgot to mention earlier that probably is one of the challenges, but can also help to achieve a kind of hopefully optimal level of landscape governance, is try to not only include innovative kind of strategy, but also kind of think collectively. I think there are still a lot to do, a lot of work to try to avoid that like kind of Western kind of point of view or Western knowledge take advantage or like take over any other kind of epistemologies that are not that powerful, so to speak. And also in terms of research, and as a researcher, I also think that there are many kind of projects, many kind of process that they work on integrating landscape approaches and probably call it differently. And it would be nice to have this kind of joint effort together and try to stop competing, so to speak, in this way. And yeah, and that's why probably I think there is no a kind of standardized optimal level of strategy of governance. Probably to me is a little bit unrealistic, so to speak. But what I can say is that there are some strategy when it comes to adaptive learning that can also include like researcher that can play like a role of brokery kind of thing. So try to, as my colleague was saying earlier, like try to put different perspectives together, different actors together, and not and try to step into a landscape, especially if you are not part of a landscape without any bias or without any kind of preconceived ideas of what the landscape is and what they want or what they need for.
So more of a facilitation role as opposed to an active, yeah, that's a very good point. You also raise a really important point about success and failure. A little anecdote from Central Africa for the tri-national region, Cameroon, Congo, and Central African Republic. We did a lot of work in that landscape over a long period of time, and success was measured in the increase in the number of elephants because the main focus of that landscape was conservation. That was not a particular success for the local farmers whose crops were being raided nightly. And so success and failure is very subjective, and we often deal with trade-offs in many respects in many of these landscapes. Please, Pragyan.
Yes, again. I don't know why I have to follow all of the great speakers, but...
You can go first next time. You can go first next time.
No, I'll try. No, I'm not complaining.
Home court advantage.
Well, again, I don't want to go into specific cases, but I feel like, like we need to distinguish between us practitioners who are doing it professionally and all of the other practitioners who are living it. And I think it starts with first us being comfortable acknowledging that successful case studies and successful examples can still happen without us. We don't need to go as an expert scientist or donor community in a local community to then, give or embark on all of the successful interventions. What I see, as I've been learning from yesterday and also engaging with a lot of our model forest partners and practitioners, there's a real passion in what they do. It's because it's the community that they're in. It is their home. We had this a global exchange with some of the model forests we worked with last year, and we all went to Chiang Mai and had, now model forest were very happy to welcome us there. I was astounded how, our colleagues from Cameroon and Thailand who were meeting for the first time had so much in common. And I feel like it's not only in model forest, it's across other interventions we do as well. When we work in restoration planning as well, IUCN as a union, we have state members, we have NGO members, we have indigenous peoples organization as members as well. When we bring all of them together, we see how much disconnect there really is, because we're so comfortable in working in our traditional setting that even questioning some of that brings a lot of defensive, emotions. A great example of this is when we're working in restoration with the health ministry in some of the countries in Africa, and you'd first wonder why work with health communities, because as scientists we discovered that there was a relation between the malaria incidence rates and the deforestation rates, and both of the ministries were not sharing data. Just like overlaying some of the GIS maps to see all of these correlations. It just sounds very natural, very, very simple, but sometimes we work in context where it's difficult to even bring people together. Mm-hmm. I feel like a successful case study is this, taking the space from our busy lives for a week, coming here and talking about what we're passionate about. We don't need to have success in terms of what we got in terms of investment returns or something tangible, intangible benefits as these convenings, especially in these times. I live in Washington, D.C., so you can imagine, just bringing everybody together who are passionate about, the topics we discuss, the livelihoods, the forest, and landscapes in general. Thank you.
Yeah, you raise a fantastic point, and this has come up in the GLF in the past, is that we're not talking about always top-down management of landscapes. There are 2 billion people who rely on the subsidy of nature in multiple use landscapes, who are managing them relatively sustainably. How can we capture that grassroots knowledge to create a much more bottom-up process as well as that top-down policy-led process? So thank you for that point. So the third round, the final round of questioning, and Pragyan, by popular demand, your own, you're going to go first. So basically this is long-term commitments. How do we move? You've talked about being in Washington, D.C. The donor environment is changing rapidly. We're moving away from the old donor model of USAID, the old DFID model from the UK. how do we maintain long-term commitments to the landscapes that we're talking about? How do we move from that project model to the wildlife process?
I think first is about recognition, I would say, and recognition in different scales. What we've been doing at IUCN, with all of the Bond Challenge commitments, we're starting to map out how much of that is actually a government commitment and how much is that a reliance on local communities to bring all of the degraded lands into a restorative state. But I also want to go deeper into long-term planning and long-term commitments, where I feel like, going back to my first intervention, that we don't spend enough time on building relationships. We talk about scaling up, scaling wide, and scaling deep, but it's not only about the interventions we do on a landscape or seascapes. It's also about deepening our relationship, deepening accountability, but also deepening the governance structure, that are already in place. I'd like to leave the stage, with all of you with a thought. When my grandmother always says, so just on a personal note, I've been trying to convince her to come visit me in the US, and to a 88-year-old farmer woman. That's a big deal. And I've been telling her there are a lot of farmlands in the US, and she says, are there cows in there plowing the fields? And I say, no, they're tractors. I tell her there are a lot of airplanes, flying over DC, but she says, I read in the news that they always crash. There are certain things that, we take it for granted that because we're living in a developed world, or living, on this side of the pond, as we sometimes say, that we feel disconnected, or sometimes we don't realize what is important on that side is lost in translation. And so I think it's about going back to our roots. You don't have to be, coming from a developing country to understand, what the problems there are. You just have to be living in one. And so I leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. And some great personal anecdotes. Malaika.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think that's a very crucial point, how, to make integrated landscape approach more sustainable. And for sure, I go back to the point that I raised at the beginning of our conversation, like stewardship of local actors, from small-scale farmer to local administration, I think is crucial. And indeed, that reminds me that also, try to integrate integrated landscape approaches and hands in hand with more decentralized kind of policy. I remember when, a few months ago, I was in Cameroon. I was in the Congo Basin, and I was talking with small-scale farmer cooperatives, and I realized that there are huge gap between what a local farmer knows really about policy, and this gap should be filled by decentralization, right? But I realized that probably there are still a lot of challenges that don't make decentralization really happen there. And then probably another point is consistent engagement. Try to improve engagement that goes beyond the time scale that we all have. And I think probably for me that's it.
Thank you. Rob?
Right. I think people recognize the connections now. Don't think in silo. Don't just work in very specific sector. So I think after COVID-19 hit us, so people see even forest conservation, health, education, water, the mountain ecosystem and the coral reef. They see connections. I think, if you talk about the long-term commitment, I would like to leave it to the landscape stakeholder. But then they need some support, for instance, like seed funding or mechanisms to ensure the sustainable finance, which somehow we're going to discuss within this week. We also need to talk about the tools and technique, how to monitor, tracking the progress, ensuring the intervention become more sustainable. You talk about the education, how to plan the young generation to understand these connections. So these are long-term kind of our intervention and commitment that probably we need to put more investment. I know that many of us are sitting as kind of development agencies. We need some kind of broker and facilitation to bring these policies and law together and no need to finger point, oh, you are a bad guy, you are a good guy, but we have to appreciate all of us and then work together, yeah, toward the common grounds. So I think, yeah, the long-term commitment is about how to help each other, support each other, yeah, to move forward.
Thank you. Patricia.
Yeah, thank you. So, you know, I think we see the success stories. We see the work that's happening on the ground. We see people who are protecting nature, who have been working in nature for, you know, they're the true guardians of the earth. So the work is already happening. I think it's very much about how we share these stories, how we make the argument that this is the direction that we need to go. I really do think it's a shift in mindset for the donor community, not only for funding for the governance piece that we already talked about, but for them to understand that deep change takes time. I mean, we talk about this so often when we're talking about landscapes and model forests. 3 years, a project that takes 3 years is not enough time to create deep change, not in the local ecological system and not among the community that's governing that space. So I really do think we need a shift in mindset, and I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Richard, you have the last word on this.
Yeah, thanks. And I guess I would start off by saying that I think from the and I think it's been touched on as well here, but landscape approaches require an initial understanding that this is a process. This is not a project that has a 1, 2, or 3 year. This is long-term stuff like the model forest here that's got 34 years of doing this. And then to address anything at a landscape level, you need the multi-stakeholders. It's not valid without it. So, you know, multi-stakeholder partnerships, long-term commitments, processes, those types of things I think are key. And then this notion of always being able to adapt, to learn, to evolve, and continue to be dynamic. I was inspired yesterday because I think I knew it, but I forgot. You know, in the Latin American Model Forest Network, they now have a youth network. Like, how fantastic is that? So, you know, you want to talk about continuing to grow, to be dynamic, to be inspired. You know, these are long-term processes, so you have to think intergenerational as well. So I think, you know, those are all key elements. The last one I just want to say is about collaborating. You know, we're here, we have IUCN, we have academia, we have RECOF from Asia, we have eco-agricultural partners, FAO is here, and GLF. No one can do all this stuff on its own anymore, right? I mean, those days are done, so collaboration is key. We do that with model forests at the landscape level. We do it regionally, but we need to do it internationally as well. And that's I think, going to be a key to longevity.
Thank you. I'm being told that we're close to wrapping up, so I won't go into a huge monologue that I was intending to. But basically, just a few points of summary. I think it's been fantastic to hear from your respective institutions the engagement that you're involved in real landscapes and real life landscapes. And from my perspective, and I think others who have been involved with the GLF for so long, seeing that shift away from thinking to doing. And I think as a tagline, perhaps the GLF people here will start thinking about that movement away from just the thinking to the actually doing and the implementation. You raised a point yesterday, Richard, which I'm going to be a bit cheeky to pick you up on. You said yesterday, I've been involved in the GLF for a long time, but not so much with the International Model Forest Network. But having seen the work of the IMFN yesterday and hearing you today, it seems that the GLF and the International Model Forest Network are not necessarily dating. I think marriage is in the air. I think there's something to be said for a much more closer collaboration. So at this stage, let me thank the panelists for their excellent interventions. So give them a round of applause, please. And thanks to everybody who's here, who's stayed awake, and probably many of you are jet lagged. And those of you online, thank you very much. And thank you, GLF. Thank you.